Welcome to Legal Innovation Spotlight, the podcast that brings you the latest advancements in legal tech and knowledge management. I'm Ted Theodoropoulos, and I connect with the industry's brightest minds to provide you with valuable insights and actionable takeaways. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. Kevin Frazier, how are you today?
Doing well, Ted. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is, you and I had a conversation actually it was this week, and talked about some of the new AI regulation that was pending, and we're going to discuss the outcome. And today is July 3rd. And I think this episode is going to get released next week. So this will be very timely information. But before we get into that, let's get you introduced. You're a AI researcher and an academic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and where you do it?
Yeah, so I'm based here in Austin, land of tacos, bats, and now the AI Innovation and Law program here at the University of Texas School of Law. So I'm the school's inaugural AI Innovation and Law Fellow, which is super exciting. So I get to help make sure that all of the students here at UT are AI literate and ready to go into the legal practice, knowing the pros and cons of AI and how best to help their clients, and also to contribute to some of these important policy conversations. So my background is doing a little bit of everything in the land of emerging tech policy. So I worked for Google for a little stint. I've worked for the government of Oregon. I was a clerk on the Montana Supreme Court. I taught law at St. Thomas University College of Law, and I did some research for a group called the Institute for Law and AI. But now I get to spend my full time here at UT teaching AI, writing about AI, and like you, podcasting about AI for a little podcast called Scaling Laws. So like you, I can't get enough of this stuff.
Absolutely, man. I'm jealous. I wish this is like a very part-time gig for me. Like I still have a day job, but your day job sounds awesome.
I can't believe I get to do this. It's the best job ever. And hopefully you find me, Ted, buried here outside the law school, and I will be my tombstone will read, "He did what he was excited by."
That's good stuff. Well, I guess before we jump into the agenda, I'm encouraged to hear that law schools are really moving in this direction. I saw a stat from the ABA that I think was in December that said it was just over 50% of law schools even had a formal AI course. So, I've had many professors on the podcast, and we have commiserated over really the lack of preparedness that new law grads have when it comes to really understanding the technology. And we also have a dynamic within the industry itself where historically clients have subsidized new associate training through the mentorship program that that Big Law has for new associate development. So it's really encouraging to hear that this is taking place.
Yeah, no, I couldn't be more proud of the UT system as a whole leaning into AI. Actually, last year here in Austin was the so-called Year of AI, where the entire campus was committed to addressing how are we going to adjust to this new technological age. And here at the law school, Dean Bobby Chesney has made it clear that as much attention as the Harvards get, the Stanfords get, the NYUs get, Austin's really a spot where if you want to go find a nexus of policymakers, venture capitalists, and AI developers, you're going to find them in Austin. And so this is really a spot that students can come to, scholars can come to, community members can come to, and find people who are knowledgeable about AI. And I think critically, something that you and I discussed earlier, curious about AI. One of my tired lines, my wife, if she ever listens to this, will say, "Oh my gosh, you said it again." I have never met an AI expert. And in fact, if I meet an AI expert, that's the surest sign that they're not, because this technology is moving too quickly. It's too complex. And anyone who thinks they have their entire head wrapped around this is just full of hooey, in my opinion. And so it's awesome to be in a spot where everyone is committed to working in an interdisciplinary fashion and a practical fashion, to your point, so that they leave the law school practice ready.
Yeah, and I mean to your point about no AI experts, the frontier labs don't even know really how these models work. I think Anthropic has done a probably the best job of all of the frontier labs really digging in and creating transparency around how these models really work, their inner workings and how they get to their output. But yeah, I mean these things are still a bit of a black box even for the people who created them.
Right. Oh, no, I've had wonderful conversations with folks like Joshua Batson at Anthropic, who was one of the leading researchers on their mechanistic interpretability report, where they went and showed, for example, that their models weren't just looking at the next best word. That's kind of the usual way we like to try to dumb down LLMs, is to just say, oh, they're just looking at the next best word based off of this distribution of training data. But if you go read that report and they write it in accessible language and it is engaging, it is a little lengthy, but maybe throw it into Notebook LLM and make that a little easier. But you see these models are actually, when you ask them to write you a poem, they're working backwards, right? They know what word they're going to end a sentence with, and they start thinking through, okay, how do I make sure I tee myself up to get this rhyming pattern going? And that level of sophistication is just scraping the surface. There's so much beneath this iceberg, and it's a really exciting time to be in this space.
Yeah, and they've also been transparent around the not so desirable human characteristics like deception that these LLMs exhibit, and I think that's also a really important aspect for people to understand for users of the system, so they can have awareness around the possibilities and really have a lens, a little bit of a healthy skepticism about what's being presented. So they've done a fantastic job. I'm a big Anthropic fan. I use, it's Claude, Gemini, and ChatGPT are my go-tos, and I use them all for different things. But I probably use Claude the least. I'm doing a lot more with Gemini now. Gemini's blowing my mind. But I will continue to support them with my $20 a month because I just love the work that they're doing and really appreciate all the transparency they're creating.
I think their writing with Claude is just incredible. To be able to tell Claude, for example, what style of writing you want to go forward with, and to be able to train it to focus on your specific writing style is exciting. But to your point, it's also key to just have folks know what are the key limitations. So, for example, sycophancy has become a huge concern across a lot of these models. My favorite example is you can go in and say, hey, write in the style of the Harvard Law Review. And for folks who aren't in the legal scholarship world, obviously getting anything published by the Harvard Law Review would be wildly exciting. You'll enter some text and you'll say, all right, give me some feedback from the perspective of the Harvard Law Review. And oftentimes you'll get, oh my gosh, this is excellent. There's no way the law review can turn you down. And I think you've nailed it on the head. But when you have that sophistication to be able to know, okay, it may be a little sycophantic. I can press it though. I can nudge it to be more of a harsh critic. And once you have that level of literacy, these tools really do have just so much potential to transform your professional and personal approach to so many tasks.
Didn't OpenAI roll back 4.5 because of this?
It's too nice. Too nice. It was too, yeah, just giving everyone too many good vibes. And I think that speaks to the fact that there is always going to be some degree of a role for a human, especially in key relationships where you have mentors, where you have close companions, where you have loved ones who are able to tell you the hard truth. That's what makes a good friend, right? And a good teacher and a good partner is they can call you out on your BS. AI, it's harder. It's proven a little bit more difficult to make them more confrontational.
Yeah, 100%. Well, when we spoke earlier in the week, there was some pending legislation that you and I talked about that I thought was super interesting. And the implications are, you know, really hard to put words around, had that piece of legislate that part of the legislation passed, and that was I'll let you explain it because you're much closer to it, but it was essentially a 10-year moratorium around state level legislation around AI. Tell us a little bit about what was proposed, and then ultimately where it landed.
Yeah. So, as part of the one big, beautiful budget bill, we saw in the House version of that bill a 10-year moratorium on a wide swath of state AI regulations. And the inclusion of that language was really out of a concern that we could see, like we have in the privacy space, a sort of patchwork approach to a key area of law. And if you go do economic analysis and look at who is most implicated by California having one set of privacy standards and New York having a different set and Virginia having its own and Washington having its own? Who does that actually impact? Well, in many cases, it tends to be small and medium sized businesses because they don't have huge compliance offices, for example, or even the businesses that are just nearing the threshold of being implicated by those privacy laws. They too have to start hiring outside counsel. They have to be monitoring what their employees are doing to make sure they comply with the nuances of each of these state bills. And so a lot of folks are concerned that we may see a similar patchwork apply in the AI context. If every state is thinking through how are we going to regulate AI differently? How do we define AI has even proven to be a difficult challenge among state legislators. And so we saw the House say, all right, we're going to move forward with a 10-year moratorium on specific state AI regulation. Now, it's important to note that the language in the House bill was wildly unclear. I'm not sure who wrote the legislation, but
AI probably.
yeah, they could have used some help from the drafting office. It was a bit unfortunate because that muddled language added a lot of confusion about how that moratorium would work in practice and what state laws would actually be implicated. The thing that the proponents of this moratorium were aiming for was that there would be a ban or a pause on state regulation that was specific to AI. And so this was really out of a concern that, again, we would have myriad standards, myriad definitions applying to AI development itself. But it didn't want to capture some of the general consumer protection laws that we know are so important to making sure everyone can, for example, buy a home without being discriminated against, be hired or fired without being discriminated against, prevent businesses from using unfair or deceptive business practices. So that was the kind of background of the House language. Well, as with all bills, we saw the House language then move into the Senate. And the Senate saw a pretty crazy, I think that's the only word that can be used to describe this, a pretty crazy debate occur between Senator Cruz, who was one of the main proponents of the moratorium, and Senator Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee, who had concerns that the moratorium might prohibit enforcement of the Elvis Act. Now, the Elvis Act is one of these AI specific laws that the Tennessee legislature passed with the specific goal of making sure that the creators, the musicians, all those folks we associate with Nashville and Tennessee would have their name, image, and likeness protected as a result of perhaps training on their music and even producing deep fakes of their songs and things like that. So there was a debate and a compromise was reached between Senator Blackburn and Senator Cruz. They reduced it to a 5-year moratorium. They made sure that the language of the moratorium was compliant with some procedural hurdles, which is a whole nother can of worms. Basically, if you have a budget bill, there has to be a budgetary ramification of the language in each provision of that budget bill. So now the moratorium was connected to broadband funds and AI deployment funds. And so all of a sudden, we just got this really crazy combination of ideas and concerns. And ultimately, the Senate decided by a vote of 99 to 1 to just strip that language out of the one big beautiful bill. So as it stands, we continue to have Congress grappling with how best to proceed. Congress has really only enacted one AI specific law, the Take It Down Act, which pertains to deepfakes. But besides that, we're still left asking, what is our national vision for AI? Where are we going to go with this huge regulatory issue? And in that sort of regulatory void, we now have 50 states. Across those states, there are hundreds of AI bills. Depending on who you ask, it's anywhere from 100 to 200 really specific AI bills. That's Stephen Adler's analysis. Whereas if you go talk to someone like Adam Thier at R Street, he'll tell you there are hundreds, if not 1,000 or more AI pieces of legislation pending before the states. And so it seems as though we may be on the precipice of a sort of AI patchwork.
Yeah, and to your point, that sounds really difficult for businesses and commerce to navigate. And I'm wondering, have we just kicked the can down the road? Because the path of each state making its own unique set of rules sounds completely unsustainable from where I sit as a business owner and someone who uses the technology every day. Is that, have we just postponed the Fed, stepping in and making some rules, or is the status quo going to be around for a little while? Do we know?
Yeah, if I had to bet, and I'll preface by saying I'm not a betting man because if you check my March Madness bracket each April, you'll see what a disaster it is. But if you look at the current political winds, I think we're going to see at least a handful of states like New York with the RAISE Act, sponsored by Assemblymember Boris. Uh, if we look at Colorado, which is actively working towards implementing the Colorado AI Act, and if we look toward California, which has already passed a bevy of AI specific laws, this patchwork is coming. And so when that patchwork does develop, we have a couple questions to ask. And this is my concern. So if you talk to folks about laboratories of democracy, they'll tell you this is exactly how federalism's supposed to work. This is great. We have states experimenting with different novel approaches to a tricky regulatory solution. Well, the issue there is that AI isn't contained by state borders, right? This isn't something like regulating a specific school district in your community or regulating a specific natural resource that's just in your state. How you regulate AI can have huge ramifications on how AI is developed and deployed across the entire state, across the entire country. And so I think that's one key element to point out is that laboratories of democracy imply that they're operating in petri dishes. And yet these petri dishes have been broken. And so one state's AI regulation is going to flood into and impact other states. Another key thing to point out about laboratories, and I'm a sucker for puns and metaphors, so apologize for leaning so heavily into this. But when you think about laboratories, you're talking about experiments, right? Well, experiments imply that you're going to learn from and adjust and change based off of the results. But something we don't see in a lot of these state laws are things like sunset clauses, things that would say, okay, we're going to try this law for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, we're going to reevaluate. Should we move forward with this legislation or should we change it? We don't see huge outlays, huge investments in things like retrospective review, where we would perhaps identify outside stakeholders and independent experts to evaluate whether that legislation worked as intended. If we had those safeguards in place to be able to say, was this a good idea in retrospect? Should we move forward with this? Or do we need to go back to the drawing board? I think that would make a lot of folks who are concerned about this patchwork more comfortable. And I hope that state legislators consider investing in and moving forward with with those sorts of safeguards. But I haven't seen that so far.
Interesting. And then I don't know if the New York Times suit against OpenAI was in federal court or state court, but there was a ruling where they had to essentially retain history for a certain period of time that created all sorts of other unintended consequences. Like h- how how are we going to navigate scenarios like that in the current state?
Yeah, so right now the pending litigation between the New York Times and OpenAI, that's in federal district court, and this preservation requirement of basically saving queries that have been entered to OpenAI has caused a lot of alarm bells to go off, especially in the legal community. I've already talked to folks at various firms who say that they've had partners, they've had clients coming to them and saying, see, this is exactly why we shouldn't use AI. And now we see that our queries may be retained, and who knows what that means for maintaining client confidentiality and attorney client privilege. And so this has opened up a pretty big can of worms. And this all speaks to the fact that we need some regulatory clarity. We know that when we have a absence of um, safeguards and an absence of knowledge about how and when laws are going to be enforced, or how especially outdated and antiquated rules and norms in various professions, how those are going to be applied in this new novel context, really adds to an unhelpful degree of ambiguity. And um, it's also important to note that should we feel comfortable from a bigger D democracy question with the fact that one judge sitting in a federal district court is upending a lot of use cases of AI right now. A lot of people are skeptical. A lot of people are scared. And this is another reason why we should be having a national conversation about AI and pressing Congress's feet to the fire to say we need a national vision. We need clarity so that we can prevent this sort of patchwork approach, and so that courts know how to proceed rather than kind of seemingly developing some unclear steps via these bespoke pieces of litigation.
Yeah, and like how does that impact OpenAI relative to its competitors? Like, I actually do a fair amount of legal analysis in the AI models for a variety of things. If I have a new hire and they have non-compete language that I have to figure out, navigate my way through, or we're dealing with an operating agreement amendment right now amongst the partners at Infodash, and I have been digging deep. I've been using other models because I don't want. I mean, it feels like it's really putting a burden on OpenAI relative to its competitors. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I don't have specific insight into whether their monthly average user count, for example, has taken a hit, or if we've seen any major changes to their clientele, especially with respect to large enterprises. My hunch is that things have definitely slowed. I know a lot of companies are using Copilot and they're saying, "Oh my gosh, why are we using Copilot? Can we find anything else to switch to?" Which is a whole nother conversation. And they probably initially were saying, "Oh, great, let's just go to OpenAI." But the second you get a lawyer in the room who's aware of this preservation request and worried about that language and worried about this perhaps occurring again in the future, uh, that may slow things down. So I think you're right to say this minimally isn't helping increase OpenAI's user base. I will say that the sheer number of users they already have and the sophistication of O3, for example, and just kind of the head start they've maintained, I don't think this is catastrophic for OpenAI, but if anything, I think it's more headwinds to the industry as a whole, that, kind of validates, rightly or wrongfully, concerns about whether these are viable tools for the long term for professionals.
Yeah, and it also brings up another interesting dynamic, which is it going to increase investments? I think these things benefit Meta, right? And the open source scenarios that you can self-host and essentially control the environment in which you engage. I don't know. Do you agree?
I would definitely agree. I think that the future will probably look a lot more open source. We know that, fortunately, Sam Altman has tipped his hand and said that OpenAI wants to go the open source route. We know that Meta is stealing more talent than the Lakers do in the offseason in terms of the number of AI experts they've poached from OpenAI as well as from Scale AI. And so I think if you just look at how this race is going to develop, more and more large enterprises are going to want to exercise more and more control over their models, and open sourcing just makes that far more feasible. There's also been an evolution, I'd say, in the national security conversation around OpenAI, or excuse me, an evolution in the national security conversation around open source. I think for a long time, there was a concern that open sourcing models would lead to bad actors getting their hands on those models sooner rather than later and using them for nefarious purposes. Following DeepSeek, which I guess is almost 7 months old now, that DeepSeek moment made a lot of people realize that the US moat with respect to peers and adversaries like China isn't as extensive, isn't as wide as previously imagined. And so, if we can get more sophisticated AI tools like open source models in more hands, we can collectively be a more savvy AI nation, a more thoughtful AI nation with respect to being able to test these models and probe them, and use the whole of America's AI expertise to make sure we are developing the most advanced and most sophisticated AI models.
Yeah. I shifting gears a little bit, like taking everything you just said and then looking at the legal industry, specifically big law. I'm of the opinion that for law firms is not a scenario where they buy ready-made off-the-shelf tools like Harvey and Legora that are great tools, and not saying you shouldn't leverage those tools, but they don't create differentiation, right? If your competitor down the street can buy the same tools as you, by definition, there's no differentiation there. Now, how you build workflows and how you use those tools can differentiate, but I'm of the belief that longer term, that law firms are going to have to invest in strategies that leverage their data and create solutions within their four walls using things like Azure OpenAI, Azure AI Search. We're actually putting our chips on that part of the table ourselves here at Infodash. We're an intranet and extranet company, but we have something called the integration hub that we deploy that makes our product work, and it lives in the client's Azure tenant, and it has tentacles into all the back office systems and respects security trimming, ethical wall boundaries. And then that enables firms to tap in using Azure AI Search. If they want to crawl and index their practice management solution, we've enabled them to do that. If they want to, we've got a labor and employment firm who has all of this amazing labor and employment data that they compile for all 50 states. And they also have all of their clients' employment agreements, employee handbooks. And we're like, hey, wait, you got the ingredients here. Use our integration hub, tap into there, build an open Azure AI Search and Azure OpenAI, go flag all the exceptions. And instead of your clients having to log in and peruse the new regulatory updates in Wisconsin, you proactively go to them and say, hey, look, you've got exceptions and we can help you remediate them. I see that as the future. I don't know. How do you view that?
I am the thing. If I could scream from the rooftops or mountaintops, you pick, would really be doubling down on this data question, because I think that folks are realizing that access to compute, even though it's difficult, that's going to be something that's regulatory or relatively available. Access to the best algorithms. Yes, we're going to see some people differentiate themselves with respect to the efficiency of those algorithms. Access to talent, obviously a huge one as well. But when it comes to identifying narrow AI use cases, the AI use cases that are going to have real practical, meaningful impact on businesses, on society, on government, it all comes back to quality data. And you and I had a conversation earlier about what's an analogy perhaps of some of the misuse we're seeing in AI right now. And for me, it kind of goes back to this notion of a Model T car. You have this tool, and if you're driving on streets in 1907 and you've got a Model T, are you going to drive across the country? No. you just won't make it. There's not the proper infrastructure there. There's no gas stations. There's no highway system. Are you even going to be able to drive it across town reliably? Maybe not, right? It depends on the context. And when you have people right now taking, as you mentioned, just kind of generative AI tools readily available to the rest of the competition, and you try to use that for your most sophisticated use case to tailor your best brief to craft a really bespoke contract, it's going to fail unless you're training it on the best high quality data. And to your point, large law firms, they're already leaning into this. They're working with the OpenAIs of the world to say, help us craft a proprietary version of ChatGPT that's been trained specifically on our vast troves of data. If you think about some of these incredibly large law firms that have an international presence, that have been in operations for decades, that have been creating contracts, thousands of them a year, if not millions of them a year. The sheer quantity of that data is going to be a huge asset for them to be able to create AI tools that give them a meaningful advantage over the competition. And that's arguably my biggest concern is that we're going to see the largest firms continue to build a larger and larger advantage over those small mom and pop shops, for example, over those boutique law firms who they don't have thousands of contracts or millions of contracts to train a model on. And so I'm a little bit concerned about what the nature, the competitive landscape of the legal ecosystem looks like a few years from now.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point. So I think that it there's a lot of dynamics in the legal marketplace that are somewhat unique. First of all, it's extremely fragmented. So the top 5 firms control less than 7% of the market. It's about 350 billion ish in legal spend, and the entire AmLaw 100 controls less than half. If you look at other industries, I use the big four because that's kind of the closest analog is accounting, um, and audit. And the big four control 97% of the audit work of all US public companies, right? Completely different concentration makeup there. So I look at, okay, the AmLaw today, extremely fragmented, very bespoke culture that has not really embraced innovation historically. They're laggards. They're in a partnership model with a cash basis accounting that prioritizes profit taking instead of capital expenditure and R&D. And I struggle to see on both ends, all ends of the spectrum, how do we get to 2.0? But big law and small law. Like, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think the first place it has to start with is law schools, which is why I'm so thrilled to be exactly where I am because we need to get more law school students who are increasingly thinking in an entrepreneurial lens, right? They've grown up in an era of move fast and break things. And increasingly, when I have new students come here to UT, they will have gone to undergrad institutions that have enterprise level AI accounts, right? They're going to have 4 years of experience, hopefully meaningful experience, and not just generating that essay at 11:30 p.m. before the deadline, but some meaningful experience using these tools. And then they're going to come in to schools like UT, and I'm going to be able to connect them with companies like Rev here in Austin. Rev is developing transcription tools that can be used in depositions, for example, to be able to pick up on new insights that were perhaps would otherwise go missed. I'm going to be able to connect them with folks like Novo here in Austin that is changing the workflow of personal injury attorneys and compiling medical documentation. And so if I can expose them to those tools as a 1L or a 2L or as a 3L, and they're the sorts of folks who are thinking about that next generation of law, then they can be on the vanguard of shaping the law firms of the future. Because I really do believe that as much of a big advantage as law firms may have right now, the largest law firms may have right now, and as great of an advantage they may have with respect to data, as we discussed, if you're a client and someone comes to you and says, "Look, I've gotten rid of all of the waste, all of the rainmaker funds that you're going to pay if you're going to go with the biggest firm. And I am this agile, client forward, AI first law firm. I think I know who I want to go with. Right. And that's the bet. That's the thing we have to lean into as legal educators and as a whole legal ecosystem, because I'm most excited by the potential for AI to really lower access to justice barriers. The kind of thing that the legal community loves to hide and not discuss is that we have a huge access to justice gap. If you look at the recent California State Bar report from 2024 analyzing how likely it was that an individual who has a civil legal issue actually receives legal counsel, it's staggeringly low and it's problematically low. And so I think that the legal community has an obligation. If you look at our rules of professional conduct, whether it's the ABA model rules or a state's rules of professional conduct, every lawyer has an obligation to the quality of the justice system. And quality has to mean that we provide everyone who has a right to defend, a right to assert, with meaningful guidance. And right now, we just don't have enough lawyers, but we can meet that need, or we can vastly expand our ability to meet that need with AI. So that's where I get excited. And that's where I really say, if we have a next generation of lawyers leaning into AI, they might manage to disrupt some of these really stodgy inertial dynamics of the legal marketplace.
Yeah, and that would eliminate a key lever if we really de- um, lower the bar for access to justice. A very common tactic is, you know, financial means, right? Like, if I know if I've got more dollars to spend on a legal proceeding than you do, that is leverage for me, right? So having that dynamic diminished, I think really changes the game and maybe produces better outcomes.
Yeah, and I think this is should be a moment where the legal industry and the legal academy looks at some of the systems and assumptions we've been making for almost 100 years and takes those head on. The federal rules of civil procedure were written in 1938. 1938, that's almost a century ago. And we're still adhering to arbitrary deadlines that someone thought would be good. We're still unsure of exactly what you need to include in your complaint to survive a motion to dismiss. These are ludicrous, antiquated ways of thinking about how people should be able to assert their rights in a country that really prizes itself on the rule of law and everyone being equal under the law. That's just not the case under these outdated systems. And so I'm optimistic that this is a time for creative thinking and for folks from across different disciplines to come to lawyers and say, "Hey, let us help you revise these norms and these rules so that you can better fulfill your purpose."
Yeah. You know, and along those lines, it obviously it's going to change the way of that law firms price, right? Their pricing strategies. And you're seeing some really interesting, challenging firms. In the UK, you have Garfield Law that's it is a AI first or maybe AI only kind of small claims. I don't know if they're a tech company or a law firm, but the rules are different over there with the Legal Services Act. And now you have Crosby AI here in the US. It's a really interesting time to be a challenger firm. But whenever I hear, and I talk a lot, in fact, I just attended a conference, inside practice event in New York on pricing. It's actually financial management and innovation, but we talked a lot about pricing. And a lot of people like to throw up concepts that sound good, like outcome based pricing and value based pricing. And I think yes, that makes sense to me, but there's challenges with that. So here in St. Louis, where I live, all the plumbing companies, I don't know if they've banded together, but they've decided that they are no longer doing time and materials work. They only do flat fee work, and they will not give you a breakdown of labor versus materials. And as a consumer, that creates a opaque veil between me and my ability to see if I'm getting a fair deal. And but I had some work done in my basement, and they came in, and I had a leak in a sewer line, and I sat back and thought about it, like, okay, what is it worth to me to not have my basement, my sewer flood my quite a lot. But I'm not going to base my willingness to pay a price based on that value or that outcome. It still comes back to supply and demand, right? In other words, if I can find another plumber to deliver the same outcome for less money, then I'm going that direction. You can't say, well, it's worth. So my basement did flood. It cost me about 45 grand. I had some insurance, but so that offset some of it. But so I know the exact cost of a flood down there. But they can't say, well, it's going to, 15%. That's a fair price. Like in the legal world, I look at it like that. Like, yes, okay, the value that you're delivering and the outcome that you may be preventing or enabling does have a dollar figure. But you being able to charge a portion of that is also influenced by supply and demand. So I don't know. What do you see? How do you see that in pricing
Yeah,
situation?
the pricing one, I'll say, leaning into my earlier comment, I'd say it's not my area of expertise in terms of thinking through how this will exactly change kind of those firm pricing tactics. But I will agree with you that I think it is so essential that we use this moment to get back to first principles about what is it that we're actually trying to achieve with our justice system. And if it's just getting money out of the litigants, that's a problem, right? And I think we need to really use this moment to explore ideas like regulatory sandboxes. So, talking earlier about my encouragement and advocacy for sunset clauses and for retrospective review, that should be the case in the legal industry as well, and how we govern ourselves. So, I want to see more states uh, actually have some degree of experimentation with how is this new tool being used? How is this new pricing system being used? Who's implicated? Who's not litigating their claims? Who's litigating too many claims? All of this should be tracked, monitored, analyzed, shared, and used as the basis to inform our rules going forward. But we're not a very empirically savvy profession, right? The fact that tech justice and tech law is something that seemingly appeared a decade or so ago or 2 decades ago is pretty indicative of a profession that's been around arguably since the beginning of time. So, maybe we could improve the extent to which we're trying to really monitor how we're doing. And I hope there is some experimentation here because the stakes are so high, to your point, Ted. And what I think is also going to be something that I think will also happen that we should keep our eye on is how is the private sector changing the way it adjudicates its own claims? So, how are we going to see businesses, for example, start to negotiate with one another rather than going to the typical public justice system? They're going to start sending over disputes and claims to AI judges and to AI adjudication systems. Why? Well, rather than waiting for months or years for that dispute to be resolved, they're just going to outsource it to an agreed upon AI system. And we should actually pay a lot of attention to how those systems are working and whether, in certain contexts, they may be appropriate to use to resolve some public disputes as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted you to touch on a topic that you wrote about that I find really interesting, and that's around like knowledge diffusion and AI literacy. And I know that's probably we could spend the whole episode just talking about that, but it's such an interesting topic. Like, can you give us a Reader's Digest version of what that means and how it impacts AI literacy?
Yeah. So let's imagine a hypothetical. I'm a law professor after all, so I have to throw out a hypo every now and again. Let's say tomorrow we get AGI. OpenAI says we've announced the most sophisticated AI tool capable of detecting cancer at 100% accuracy, capable of tutoring everyone according to their learning style and learning abilities. All of that's available tomorrow. I don't think we'd actually make a ton of use of it, right? If it came about tomorrow, we have the American Medical Association would want to kick the tires of that AI. We'd have parent teacher associations that would want to thoroughly vet any implementation of that AI. School districts, state bars, as we've talked about. You name the profession, you name all of these different barriers and frictions. In many cases, I think those are appropriate, right? We should have a degree of skepticism of making sure that before we introduce these AI tools into really sensitive, really important use cases, let's make sure we're vetting them. Let's make sure we understand what we're about to proceed with. How we do that vetting and whether that vetting is actually successful and rational and not based off of skepticism or fear or concerns about black swan events where the whole of society gets turned into paper clips, that's contingent upon AI literacy. Do folks have enough of an understanding of how the technology works? Do they have enough experience with the technology to know its best limitations, or excuse me, to know its limitations and its best use cases? Do they have a willingness to experiment with that technology in really important cases? If the answer is no to those questions, then it doesn't matter if America is the first to achieve AGI, right? That's my big concern about
Yeah.
the lack of emphasis we've placed on knowledge diffusion. Because right now, we know that China, for example, is investing heavily in increasing the number of PhDs with expertise in AI. We know that other countries are actively trying to solicit as many AI experts as possible to move to their country and to lend their expertise to their governments, to their businesses, to their schools. Estonia has a mandate for all of their public school students to be exposed to AI. Where do we see that sort of vision here in the States? We've yet to have meaningful, for example, what I've called for an AI education core. Why aren't we using our community colleges, for instance, to help train and deploy folks who can then go to small businesses in their community and say, oh, here's an AI tool that would really help you out. And let me help you integrate that into your small business. We can have public libraries serve as hubs for AI companies to come do demonstrations for people to learn about the latest and greatest AI. These steps are really important. And for listeners who are thinking, oh, okay, well, this all sounds nice. And yeah, it would be excellent if we could diffuse all this and increase the general level of AI literacy. I encourage those folks who are maybe a little skeptical to go read the work of Jeffrey Ding. Jeffrey Ding is an economist, and he's studied this diffusion question closely. And in the context of the Cold War, it was often the USSR who was the first to innovate, right? They were the first to get to Sputnik, for example. They made a lot of early advances on weapon systems that we were lagging behind. Why did we win? Well, we had more engineers, we had more scientists, we had more general expertise so that we could turn those innovations into actual progress, into actual tangible goods and services in a much faster fashion. And so, knowledge diffusion really is the key to turning innovation into progress. And we need to place a greater emphasis on that.
I couldn't agree more. I love the community college idea and the public library idea that you pose. And I would say, let's start with some knowledge diffusion among the legislators,
Yes.
the ones making the rules. You
Well, and
know,
not only them, but I'd also not be a good academic if I didn't err on being a little self promotional. I wrote a whole law review article called what it was like an F in judicial education, and it's all about how if you go talk to state judges, they're not getting recurring, meaningful education on the latest technology. If you go talk to Supreme Court judges on various state Supreme Courts, it's not like they go get a briefing from OpenAI about how AI works. Like the rest of us, they're just trying to figure it out by doing some Googling or perplexity searches, I guess now, or trying to hope that their clerks have learned about AI. That's not a really reliable, good strategy for a high quality justice system.
No doubt. I had a judge on, God, it must have been 6 months ago, Judge Scott Schlegel in Louisiana. And
Nice.
he gave a really good assessment of just the state of the judicial system, um, technology wide, not just AI specifically,
Right.
and their inability and their lack of readiness around. He works a lot with domestic violence cases, and the ability to use deep fake technology on both sides of the equation and just the risks around that. And it was like
Yeah.
such a good
No.
episode.
It's wild, and I think that the more we continue to see schools like UT, schools like Vanderbilt lean into AI and try to make sure the next generation is AI literate and achieving that sort of knowledge diffusion among key professionals, the better we can serve everyone. I mean, the same goes for doctors as well, right? Do you want a doctor who doesn't trust radiological AI tools, despite them having 99 or 95-degree accuracy or far greater accuracy than the human equivalent? I'd rather
Yeah.
go to the AI doctor, right? So we need this across so many professions.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Well, this has been a great conversation. How to tell our listeners how to find out more? It sounds like you got a podcast. What's the name of it? How do they find your writing? How do they connect with you?
Yeah, yeah. So if you want to listen to Scaling Laws, if you're interested in AI policy, AI governance, check out Scaling Laws. Should be available on all podcast sites that you go to. If you want my own musings on AI, I write on Substack at Appleseed AI, like Johnny Appleseed, trying to spread the word, trying to diffuse some AI knowledge. And then you can always find me on X and Blue Sky at Kevin T. Frazier. But yeah, really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Ted, and hope we can do this again because this was a hoot and a half.
Yeah, I don't think we got to half of the agenda topics that we were talking about, but it was a great discussion nonetheless. So, listen, have a great holiday weekend, and I look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you. And yeah, hope to see you in St. Louis sometime.
That sounds great. All right. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Legal Innovation Spotlight. If you found value in this chat, hit the subscribe button to be notified when we release new episodes. We'd also really appreciate it if you could take a moment to rate us and leave us a review wherever you're listening right now. Your feedback helps us provide you with top-notch content.